You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Like I was putting skateboarding pictures and shit on my wall at like 19, 20, like
How heavy were
dirt
you?
biking. Dude, that not even heavy. Dude, I think I was like a buck 30 in like high school or something. Buck 40. Maybe.
Dude,
I was a skinny little kid.
talk
Dude,
about
I
a
was
high school
small.
reunion you want to go to. Good for you.
I know. I think it's next year. Yeah. So yeah, we'll
Wait,
see. I don't know.
actually?
No, it's actually they're planning it. Yeah. It's like a 10-year reunion next year. Yeah.
Unfollow. No, get that comes through a Facebook account. You don't need that smoke in your life. There's no good can come from that.
I think that
Zero
yeah,
percent chance.
the only reason I think I might go is just so I could just hang out with my close buddies who I normally talk to, because they're all just going to be in the same place at once. But maybe we should just convene elsewhere other than there. I don't
David
know.
Buster's, literally anywhere. Like it just
Yeah,
no
anywhere else.
zero. I think you bring up an interesting point though. Like other sports are limited and gate kept on the age that you can get in. Like, NFL football, by the time you're going through a 4-year program, which now guys are incentivized to do, you're not entering the league until 21, 22 in most cases. In some cases, if you're a 5-year guy, 23, 24. Does bodybuilding, like, does the IFBB in your mind have an obligation to, like, try and make the sport healthier? And it's like, is it
I,
possible?
that's a heavy topic. I think you'll find counter, arguments on both sides. I think inherently it it never will be. You're challenged with the people who are going to chase bodybuilding to any degree and do whatever it takes to get there. And but we were just talking about the obituaries coming up left and right because people will do anything that it takes to get there. And so I think there could be some use. And I think what's changed here now and what's been really helpful is that there is a massive amount of education that's being put out there now that wasn't readily available years ago. And I think it's making maybe a small impact now, but at least for the better. And so I think more shows at least are trying to adopt that, um, or at least more coaches anyway. So, but gosh, should the IFBB like have something in place to make it a healthier sport? I don't know. What's healthier?
Well, my thing too is like I grew up in this small kind of ghetto town just opposite the border of Detroit, Michigan, and it's like when with bodybuilding, if majority of the world thinks performance enhancing drugs are cheating, which everyone in the bodybuilding community knows they're not, it's fair play,
Yeah.
which is part of the problem. But once you've adopted the fact that like I'm going to stick this stuff in my body to get bigger, lying on a birth certificate is like small time shit. So it's like, oh, I got to be 19. I'll just lie on my birth certificate. I've run in trend and
Right.
massive probe. And because there was a guy, he was my friends work at the border between Canada and the US. And there was this guy, I'll maybe put this in a clip and attach the newspaper article. There was a 32-year-old man who was like from Detroit who was enrolled on some real 21 Jump Street shit in a high school in Windsor who would cross the border every day. He was like 6'7", and he played on the high school basketball team. Just fucking like Joanna Man and kids. And then he like just went back. Like, dude he was like from Somalia. He had like a family in Detroit. Like, and they thought, I'm going off to work. And he's like, no, I'm going to
Right.
sleep in math class and then dunk on an 11th grader. It's like, yeah, someone's got to like, oh, I'm going to compete at a bodybuilding show. And all I need to do is tell them I'm 19 or whatever. Yeah, that's probably not really enforceable.
Yeah, it's too hard. I think it's definitely too hard. So what do you do? Yeah, I think you do your best to. I guess if you have integrity as a coach, you put yourself out there and you put some information, education out there to, hey, don't fuck yourself up like I did, which is kind of inherently how I fell into this space overall. You know,
Yeah, talk about it.
yeah,
I'm curious of like how, because what do we do? It's like, well, we do what you do for a living now, which I want to get into. But like, tell us like, how did you get into the space of like looking at looking at blood work primarily, looking at ancillary health markers, and then intervening at various levels to try and make people healthy? What was your like come to Jesus and like, oh, I should probably not.
yeah, right. God, I think in some ways I was driven towards this because of the inherent sort of passion I have for just fitness and being interested in what the human body can do overall. And then also driven because I fucked myself up because I took too many drugs under, whether that was my own doing, being coached by the wrong people, or like what you hear or read on the internet. So yeah, after I graduated from San Jose State, I just like, I don't really know what I want to do. I thought I'd go into more like on the clinical side. And I was working as an EMT for a little bit, and then I actually ended up in cardiac rehab as an exercise physiologist. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then I got into calisthenics. It was like not even, bodybuilding at all, which I think was a good thing, because having that, here comes the smoke bomb word, kinesthetic awareness, just understanding like what it means to be like in your body at any given time and place, and how you're moving relative to your environment. That and wanting to push that further. Like, okay, well now I'm actually just kind of like trying to get jacked, and how do I get jacked? And so, but yeah, I just started kind of bodybuilding. I had some friends in the space, in the Bay Area that were into it, just kind of following their lead naturally. And, one buddy just asked me, hey, you want to do a show? And I'm like, all right, cool. So got into that, did my first show in like 2017. And, but I wasn't really like deep into it. I didn't really know much. After that, I was like, well, maybe I'll kind of really fully dive into this, and started working with a coach. And through that process, I was instructed to take, just certain compounds, and some maybe were helpful, some not so helpful, and started experiencing side effects. And I'm like, how come other guys don't have side effects like I do? Or like maybe they don't talk about it, or is this normal? The post show sort of rebound, like completely disastrous. And is this part of it? Is this normal? And so I didn't really have like the answers. And I'm like, all right, fuck this. Like, I need to figure out how to mitigate any of these health risks on my own, start asking questions, start diving in, doing the research. And so I really just dove in. And then after I started figuring out what was going on with me, I realized like people were coming to me, asking me the same questions. I'm like, well, I only know what I know, and I know that's not a lot. So I should probably research some more. I was smart enough to know that I didn't know everything, and I still don't. But I realized I almost have like an obligation here to serve as this kind of, I don't know, problem solver. And that's ultimately how I got more and more into understanding drugs, lab work, bodybuilding training, like nutrition training, all of the things, and just honing in on that over time, just being deep into the kind of the trenches of it all, not just from this broad spectrum understanding, like, oh, if I just eat a lot, I train hard, like I should get bigger. Like it starts there, but the more nuanced approach is really kind of where you have to go, I guess, when you start wanting to make more marginal changes after the more advanced you get with any sport, given whatever relative sport that is. So, yeah, I don't know if I had like a come to Jesus moment. Maybe after after one of my shows where I rebounded. So, dude, I had like pitting edema. Like I didn't look like how I should look, dude. Yeah, so
can we dive into this a little bit? Like, so I'm assuming this is like ankles and feet. You wake up one morning
dude,
and you're just
bad.
Oh, okay, like how far? Yeah. I'm so blown away. How far post show? What were your initial thoughts? What drugs do you think did this? Like just like a protein metabolism thing? like go in on that.
Yeah. So, first it started like I didn't really have any instructions. Like, okay, show's over, cool, see ya, have fun. And I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna fucking just eat, dude. Right? Like my I am like I've been deprived of all this food, so my hunger, obviously, ghrelin is like through the fucking roof, and I'm like, I'm ready to eat anything and everything. Lived across the street from like a Chipotle, so naturally, like I'm going to go there, get all the Chipotle that I want. And obviously, like, what really kind of kickstarted it all is having these compounds, these drugs in place. Also, naturally, for some people, the goal is to, or their sort of stack design is have a diazide or some sort of diuretic in place, um, which inherently like compromises the body's ability for fluid management overall. So having that in place, and then all of a sudden, like the next day, filling my face with whatever the fuck. I think we got like a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts, followed by BJ's. The next day, I had Chipotle. So this like rapid sort of sodium, fat, glucose intake, along with like not enough water, having that sort of diuretic in my system, and then that, it was just a clusterfuck, really. And then I wake up and I'm like, my feet look like I can't even see my ankles. I'm like, man, what's going on here? Is this normal? Like not having any idea as to what's going on. And this is like, okay, well, I guess I'll just ride this out. Like, do I go to the hospital or I don't know? So, yeah, it was not good, potential like renal failure. I don't know. Like I didn't have any answers. So it was kind of at that point where I'm like, I don't think this is normal post show. And if it is, then I don't know if I ever want to do this again. And so that was kind of like a big major initial turning point as to like, is this what it's normally like? Am I having the improper guidance here? What's going on? So I just needed more answers and I didn't really have them. And that's was like, all right, this is enough. Like I can't have this. I hate not knowing, I hate not knowing. So kind of led
But
to,
it's odd for a sport that is so defined by someone's wantingness for control that so often people end up in places that they're completely out of control. It's
completely.
such a they bring their Tupperware containers to family dinners and they bring their water jugs which are so dumb and stupid and shaped like dumbbells now, which I thought was really stupid. I saw them
Yeah.
at the gym the other day. And then when it comes to like the thing that matters most, they have absolutely no clue and no control, no metric to manage.
None at all, dude. It's like scary, and some people take that too far. And this is, where you see pros like dying, because they take diuretics and shit like that and they overdo it. And so if you take an amateur, which, I guess I'm still an amateur, but I know a lot more now than I did then. I was just, I was blindly sort of ignorant to what I was getting myself into. And that is the gap that I really aim to close now for not just myself, but like anybody that I work with. So
So
on multiple levels.
how soon after the Violet Beauregard pitting edema ankles did you get your first blood panel? Okay,
I don't
that
even
laugh
know.
means
I
not
don't even
soon
know.
enough. not
Yeah,
not soon enough.
definitely not soon enough. Yeah, not soon enough because I'm like, oh, we're supposed to get lab work done. Like, where? How do I even? Who do I go to? Do I go to my doctor? Say, hey, I all these drugs. I took all these drugs. Like, and in my head, I'm like, if I tell him I took all these drugs, like, is that what's he gonna do? Like, who's he gonna tell? Am I gonna be in trouble? Like completely clueless. So I'm like, oh, I'm gonna tough this one out. So I honestly don't even remember the last time. Like after that, like when I had gotten lab work, and then maybe it was like a year and a half or two later. I'm like, oh, like this was completely wrong from the start. So
What did
took
now
some time.
in the first blood panels that you recall? What were some things after an early career of competitive bodybuilding and the performance enhancing drugs that come with that, and potentially the poor guidance pre, post, intra show? What were some things that really jumped off the page for you? And maybe
Yeah.
now in your experience as you work with this community, what are things that are consistent about your experience that you see from other people in similar situations?
Yeah, great question. First, I mean, it's inflammatory markers. So, like you have C-reactive protein, which, granted, it's just a flag. It's not necessarily a, hey, this is inflamed, and it's going to point to exactly where that inflammation is coming from. But that is one. Uh, Homocysteine is another one. Your lipid profile, that's pretty much standard, right? Your LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterols, most of those are going to be compromised when you're utilizing any sort of compound, especially at higher dosages. And then you factor in not just injectables, but you factor in any orals on top of that. Are they 17 alpha alkylated? Are they going to be liver toxic? Obviously, the dosage and duration is going to influence the impact that it's going to have on organ function. But yeah, so liver, your people are traditionally saying, your AST, your ALT. I didn't even know longer, I didn't even know at that time that, oh, I should be checking some other liver markers, GGT, alkaline phosphatase, all these other ones. And, but yeah, it's highly sensitive C-reactive protein, liver enzymes, kidney function too. That one's kind of tough because people get caught up in creatinine and blood urea nitrogen, which can be confusing because if you just have if you eat some red meat, if you consume protein, if a higher amount of protein, if you consume creatine, then those values are going to be elevated already. So, um, yeah, but that the lipid profile is seeing your LDL cholesterol like, oh shit, it's at like a 150, and now we have better markers like apolipoprotein B, and so we see like, oh, how much atherogenic risk am I really, uh, you know, how compromised am I? So lipid profile, and this is like not even considering where your testosterone's at, right? I think historically back then, and unfortunately still now, people are concerned with, oh, well, like, where's my estradiol at? How high is it? Oh shit, like my testosterone's like 1500 and my estradiol's like a 90. Oh, it's too high. Like I need to push that estradiol down. I need to take an aromatase inhibitor. And it, there's just so much confusion around what you're seeing in lab work. And you have to have clarity around that and understand the context and what you're taking, how long you're taking it for, what you can expect to see in your labs. And but yeah, it can be kind of scary, right? Because if you don't, if you see these markers and they're all jumping off the page, everything's all bold and red, and you're like, oh shit, like this can't be good. People will see hematocrit, hemoglobin, red blood cell count, all like higher, which naturally those will be higher when you are on testosterone. Some elevations really aren't bad. I mean, think about it this way: like, where's the Olympic Stadium? Isn't it in Colorado at a higher elevation? Like they have, I believe it's there. One of the reasons, anyway, is to have this sort of higher hemoglobin, higher altitude, driving more oxygen to your tissues. And like, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have higher hemoglobin and hematocrit values when you're driving more oxygen to your tissue overall. But obviously, too high can be problematic. So, context is needed when looking at lab
Now,
work.
now you obviously, so you work for Marek Health. That's how we sort of got reconnected. Now, what have you learned about blood work, maybe at a higher level, since you've, I'm sure, seen hundreds of thousands of panels now? Like, how did the way you prioritize, or how is it that you go through blood work now, and how is it different than when you first went through it? Like, what are the big things that after you look at a ton of blood work and you talk to a ton of people, with the
Right,
services you guys provide on the back end, like how is
right.
that how has that thought process changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think now, if I take a step back before I even look at the lab work, and this is where kind of that turning point came from earlier, and recognizing everything that I went through previously, like, well, what led me up to that point of needing lab work, or the reasons why I should have had the lab work completed. And so, what I mean by that is like the context and what's going on outside of your life and what influences that lab work, right? And so those are conversations that need to be had between you and whoever lab work you're looking at, right? Like, who are you, right? Like, how old are you? What does your daily life look like? Are you working from home? Are you sitting on the couch all day? Are you working blue collar job? What are you taking any drugs, extracurricular activities that you're doing? What does that look like? What is your stress like on a daily average? What is your food intake like? What is your sleep like? Do you sleep like shit? Do you work night shift? What is all that? So all that is all taken into context first before you even kind of go through this step by step process of looking at their labs, because I need to have context, right? Like I mentioned C-reactive protein, right? I typically, like, we like to see that less than a 1 on somebody's labs. We can aggressively say less than 0.75. I just met with somebody earlier today. Her C-reactive protein was over 100.
What?
She was sick. Yeah.
Were they on fire? That's insane.
Yeah, she's on fire. Just sitting there on fire. But no, like, when I see that, I'm like, my first thought, like, were you sick when you got these labs? Like, what was going on? And she's like, oh yeah, like, I was like, she was sick, like she had the flu or some virus, and she was just like not feeling well. So, like, the context matters. Like, if I didn't know any of that stuff, then what am I gonna, like, sound the alarm? Oh fuck, like, you gotta go to the
911.
hospital. Yeah, yeah, call 911 now. What's going on? So that whole conversation has to happen before I look at the lab work. And then from there, you kind of just, break it down kind of section by section. What does their metabolic profile look like? Their lipid profile look like? Obviously, we're looking at the sex hormone profile, but people put a lot of emphasis on that. Oh, what's, like, I want to just jump straight to my testosterone, or especially guys. Like, well, hold on. Like, let's look at everything else. Like, organ function, what does that look like? There's some pretty cool gut inflammatory markers you can look at, endothelial integrity too. Like, are you having anything that compromises any sort of vasodilation? And then just kind of go from there. So I think people have to understand that it essentially is like a symphony. If one dude is fucking with the trumpet on the backside and the drums aren't matching up, like, the shit ain't gonna sound good. It's not like Hans Zimmer is like, no, it's not gonna work. So we have to understand the context of everything, and that's kind of how you break it down section by section, sort of that way, just to understand. So
Now,
yeah.
coming outside of the performance enhancing drug world and into just the general population world, obviously, when people get into PEDs now, you don't have to look far to know that, okay, the lipids might get fucked up, the hematocrit might get fucked up, liver enzymes, depending on what you take. Like, that was kind of hearsay back when I started, when I was, basically a kid. But what about the population of people who are coming just for, like, health optimization? Like, what type of mixed bag are you seeing here? Like, when you're talking to people who aren't coming to you and be like, hey man, like, I'm trying to repent from my metabolic sins here. Like, just people just trying to get healthier. What do you see commonly, or maybe in some cases, what have been some of the more abnormal shit that you've seen?
Yeah, a lot of the times we'll catch things like, it's kind of all over the place. If somebody has had a history, like their family history, like familial hypercholesterolemia, like, do they have a history of poor cholesterol values over time? A lot of times we'll catch some people, like, some thyroid antibodies that some people are just, like, completely unaware of. They're just, whether they're tired all the time, or sometimes they're not, man. Like, honestly, like, I'll see some people, I'm like, hey, like, they just want to get a full panel done because they're like, I've never seen all of this stuff before. And the panels that I have gotten, they're like, I don't know, maybe they've got like 50 markers or less. And, we really just want to see some everything. And sometimes we'll catch some thyroid antibodies on there, like, hey, look, like, you might have Hashimoto's and you don't even realize. So some stuff like that, or gut inflammatory markers. Yeah, you see some kind of crazy stuff, but I think more often than not, like, generally, we're just seeing people's, like, metabolic profile, like, just pretty substantially, like, just unsatisfactory, right? It's compromised. Their metabolic syndrome, like, their A1C they're diabetic, right? Their fasting insulin is super high. And then you see inflammation on top of that. Then you see lipid profiles skewed. And that's when it that's when you have to go back to the conversation of like, okay, like here's your quantitative data on the lab work. Like this didn't just come out of nowhere and it didn't get here overnight. Like, let's go back to the conversation we were having about your lifestyle and figure out how things got here. Um, because that's where the real work happens. You know, it's not like, hey, take this pill. We're gonna fix everything for you. Here's some Ozempic. You know?
If you had to average out like the blood panels that you see from, you know, habitual PED users and compare it, and it's subjective, so and I guess a part of it is objective, and compare it to the maybe you just bucketed non-PED users versus PED users, understanding now that if a PED user, competitive bodybuilder, strength athlete, is going down the route of being proactive with their health in going through this, potentially they have already taken strides in their health to offset, right? Now I think
Right.
just with the services that you guys provide, that it's more readily available than, you know, when you were walking around with bowling balls for ankles, or when I started, or anything like that.
Yeah.
But do you get like a general sense that the average PED user healthier, and I hate to use the word, than
Yeah.
the average person that comes in, just because of the exclusion criteria of a PED user that also intersects with, you know, being proactive with blood work?
That's a great question. I think now so more than ever, it actually is kind of crossing that threshold where somebody who is taking, you know, any sort of PEDs, they actually live their lifestyle for the most part. Obviously, there's extremes there. They are for the most part, I think, living an overall healthier lifestyle. And those who really want to take their physique to that next level, they owe it to themselves to do so because there is no way to reach that higher level unless they are doing those things and like getting enough sleep, mitigating any sort of stress. And so they're living their life in a sort of healthier fashion. Yeah, of course, like PEDs are going to inherently be risky, but I think with the amount of education that's out there now and the amount of like amazing coaches who have this a moral compass and who have integrity, they are laying out, hey, where is your risk profile to begin with you genetically or you like lifestyle wise? What are you willing to like how close are you or like how willing are you to get close to that threshold of like, all right, the risk is there, the reward is there, laying that out and saying, all right, like the option's yours. If you want to do this, this is what you're looking at. You have the lab work, you have the data to back that up, and allow them to kind of make that decision. But I would say, to answer your question, for the most part, I think now anyway, people are a lot healthier now. I mean, I am myself one of those people who I'm a much healthier bodybuilder now than I was then. So
I'm curious, like when you see blood work from, you know, let's say non users versus users, to make it super simple, is there a thing that consistently on either side of the aisle is like, oh my God, this is going to fuck you up? So for like steroid users, bodybuilders, strength athletes, can you look at a panel and be like, oh my God, this guy's taking this? Are you out of your fucking mind? And on the flip side of that, is there an activity or a habit or a drug that's non-performance enhancing related on the recreational, just sort of everyday life, run of the mill 9 to 5 crowd? Is there a consistent habit or drug or behavior that just like you can look at a blood panel and be like, oh, this, wow, hey, do you partake in X, Y, or Z?
yeah, dude, I'd say the lifestyle, the behavior thing is probably number one. I mean, it really just comes down to uh, overeating and moving a lot less. What you're putting in your mouth over time. And with that, if we decide to pick a particular drug, if we consider alcohol that drug, like alcohol is a big one. It's a big one for sure, which usually, it usually comes with more food. Yes. Just think about in any sort of social events you ever go to, like there's alcohol for good reason. With alcohol comes a great, like selection of food usually. And people usually overeat and they don't move enough. And so it's just that sort of inherent behavior, and whether that's learned behavior from when they are young and growing up and they don't even necessarily know better, or they do know better and they do it anyways because they just don't care. Whatever combination, it's the same thing, those same behaviors, and ultimately lead to higher risk factors for those who are already predisposed to them, or they have developed those, those risks because of their, they just don't care. So,
I want to dig in on this because if there's a substance in this world that I could do away with tomorrow, it would be alcohol. I stopped drinking 15, 16 years ago. Like, it was basically became legal in Canada. I'm like, oh, I'm not breaking the law anymore. This is no fun. And I was like, okay, fuck it. I just haven't had a drop since. And it's something where, like, I don't go out into public because I know people are drunk on weekends. I don't drive my car on holidays where I know people are drinking. I think it is the worst thing on the planet Earth. I think if we make it past North Korea and China and Trump or like whoever you're concerned about, and we look back in 100 years, like, man, I can't believe you could just buy it at stores. Can't believe you could have just gone in and just bought a handle and killed yourself. What is it that when people consume alcohol on a regular basis, what are the things that really start to go awry in their blood work?
yeah, man, that's great. First of all, like that's awesome. I'm proud of you. It's a hard decision to make.
I don't have a
And
medallion or anything. I think it is. Here, I'm going to stop
I'll
you real
give you
quick
one.
because, like, I think it's the tattoos, and I'm sure you get this. But every time I put something up a few weeks ago about, like, I don't know, I just don't drink alcohol, and people are like, start sending me like numbers, and I'm like, why is everyone sending me numbers? I'm like, oh, that's the days they've been sober. I'm like, yo, I don't
Oh
go to
yeah,
meetings. I just like don't. I just like. My dad was broke, and
yeah,
I drank cheap shit until I thought I was going to go blind, and then I was like, this is terrible. I drank beer that was
yeah,
supposedly tastes like honey for like 3 years, and I was like, I'm going to stop doing this. This is yeah.
yeah.
It blew my mind. The number of people that were
It,
like,
look at you, dude. You're just the power of saying that. You know, go drink your water.
just an just an
Uh,
idiot. It's 80 proof.
I
I'm
mean,
actually hammered right now. Imagine it's just straight. I'm Jim Leahy. I'm just sitting here sipping straight Grey Goose on the pod. Nuts.
you're a different kind of animal if that's the case. Yeah, it's so disastrous. It is like an absolute. It's just like kind of like a bomb going off in the body. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like I drink socially. I'm not out here telling anybody what to do with their lives, but it is pretty like the effects that we see in lab work over time are terrible. And again, it's not just alcohol. It's what somebody does with their behaviors when they're consuming alcohol consistently. And you can even extrapolate that to like behavior in terms of how they talk to people, how that affects them psychologically. So liver enzymes, that's where it's going to be metabolized. You're going to see some liver enzymes like be pretty skewed from the start there. And then again, from there, it's like, well, what is that doing to overall? That's a probably hot topic, testosterone over time. How is that lowering testosterone values when we are noticing this correlation between higher alcohol consumption, reduced testosterone values, also higher body fat increase? So you see, it's kind of like it's a proportional scale of like body fat increases over time, reduced testosterone, increased side effects, and you add any other sort of drugs on top of that. Just the way that you eat over time. So it's just compounding what it does. And energy level or shit. I mean, well, maybe not everybody, but if you've ever experienced some sort of hangover at one point in time, just think of outside of the brain and how that makes you feel, like what that's doing to your body over time. How often are you drinking? And if you have any sort of performance, if you're an athlete, you're doing yourself just a disservice at this point, really. If you're trying to be that person, you're trying to be that athlete, you're trying to be the Kobe, the MJ, Tiger Woods, whoever, like you can't really afford that, especially if you're not some genetically gifted fucking, person, which I certainly am not. So you have to consider that too. Like, can do you want to be that person? Like, are you trying to be that athlete? And that's not to say like if you're not trying to be that athlete, then it's okay. It's still like terrible for your body. So
Yeah, drinking has such like it's so many, like you kind of alluded to on the social side, like so many cultural implications that like, I have friends that are from former Yugoslavia, and it's like to say to their mother that you're not drinking Schlivo is like get the fuck out of the house. Like you might as well be Croatian, right? Like you might as well tell them my Serbian friend's mother that you're Albanian. Like you're getting kicked out of the house. Like forget about it. But it's like
yeah,
there are less ubiquitous cultural phenomenon now, and where I'm going with this is through the route of like fad dieting, like carnivore, keto, paleo, the sort of immersion of what I call diet identities that have popped up probably since like the early to mid 2010 era. I think CrossFit really took that into the mainstream. What of these types of nutritional habits, obviously, we hope maybe not as bad as alcohol consumption, but what does a long-term commitment to certain diets manifest, or how does that manifest in blood work? A pescatarian, vegan, raw vegan, all of these different things that have popped up. Where do you kind of see it behind the scenes really having an effect? And are there any one of those players that is particularly egregious when it comes to offending your metabolism?
yeah. I'd say if we're talking particularly egregious here, one of the more popular ones as of the last several years, the carnivore diet, looking at, just overall lipid profiles. Now, there are the camps out there, and trust me, I have the clients that I work with consistently who are like, I don't believe in cholesterol. I don't care if it's high. I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do, and I'm going to continue eating this way because I feel good. Sure. Okay. There's direct correlation with more cardiovascular risk when you have, higher low density lipoprotein, like, your LDL cholesterol is higher when your apolipoprotein B is high. Like there's that risk there. And there's really, you know, I don't even want to get into well, you should or you shouldn't. Like it just, the data's there to support it. Whether you want to treat it as such, as a sort of crisis management and adjust your style of dietary preferences, then that's on you. But that is by far one of the things I see the most. When I see, uh, iron overload, higher iron values over time. I see, and again with the cholesterol and triglycerides, just fats in the blood, like just high, right? People have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I see this all the time, and of course, I can go back to our conversation because I've seen and I've written down like I asked them, well, what's your diet like? And they talk to me about their red meat consumption. And then I really get an idea of like what that red meat consumption is like on average over time when I see their values. And so that's a huge one. If we kind of transition to other styles of dieting, like if it's keto style, we'll traditionally see, if you asked about metabolic profile, what's interesting is that when people do consistently eat lower carb diets over time, we'll see an A1C, which, hemoglobin A1C, a 90-day average on blood glucose. We'll see those values actually like kind of high. And what it is interestingly, they're like, oh, well, I don't eat very many carbs. Sometimes we'll even see like ketones in the urinalysis. And so they're obviously like eating low carb, but we'll see that A1C higher. And it's predominantly a physiologic response. So if you think about it, like the brain thrives off of glycogen, right? And we get carbs from glycogen from carbs. And when we don't really have as much of that, what's going to happen peripherally in the tissues is like the body's going to kind of shut that off, so it doesn't really go peripherally. It kind of drives it to the brain, and as a result, like we'll see that A1C go higher on the lab work, but it's not pathologic. It's just kind of physiologic. So that's an interesting one that, we'll see often, metabolically anyways. But outside of that, then we transition to what do their triglycerides look like over time and any other inflammatory markers. And then are they getting enough protein even though they're on keto? That's a number one, that's a big one too. People get lost in the weeds, man. They'll like step over dollars to pick up pennies and like, well, I'm just going to lose a lot of weight and I'm just going to go on keto or whatever diet they choose. Intermittent fasting is another big one too. Speaking of which, like people decide to go on intermittent fasting because they are like, oh, when I'm fasting, my growth hormone's going to rise and I'm going to get jacked or whatever. Um, doesn't happen like that, but people get lost. They get lost in the like paralysis by analysis, dude. And they miss the big picture, and it's usually the downfalls. Like, hold on, like back up. Like, how many calories are you consuming versus your expenditure? What does that look like overall? I don't really give a shit like what diet you choose to personally like follow. But if you aren't understanding this sort of larger picture that contributes to where your weight is going, inflammation, performance, if you're an athlete and if you're concerned about like what you're putting in your body and not how you perform and you're really trying to be an athlete, then I don't know, maybe you should put some extra thought into that. So that's not to knock on anybody who's like a vegan or something and they're trying to be I don't know, NFL athlete or something like that. But it's just there's understanding what particular foods do for your body, what roles they serve, and how your body's going to perform as a result of consuming, those foods.
You talked about the denigration of compounding bad habits. I'm curious, in your experience, have you come across like some absolute Hail Marys which show the power of habits working in a positive direction? Where like, are there any blood labs where you're like, oh, this person's like dead. There's no way. Like this person, like this is the worst blood lab I've ever seen. But then just done a complete habit 180 and then brought it back to life. And because I think that's where there's this sunken cost fallacy that I've come across in some people in my, maybe not in my professional life, but in my personal life, we've been struggling with health issues. And there's this idea where like, it's a too little too late. I might as well enjoy my life. I'm not going to go through I'm not going to, I'm going to keep drinking beer because that's what I've always done. And they just don't think that the changing of the habits will actually move sort of the health needle, either whether it's a stage of their life, being later in life, or being so far afield on the metabolic scale of normality that they're just like, fuck it. But in your experience, have you come across any like, wow, this person came from this fucking dog shit blood lab and they deployed X, Y, and Z habit and now they're here?
Yeah, this is the beautiful side of coaching, and this is where this is what keeps me in the space. Honestly, like as much kind of like negativity I see in it, with whether that's choosing to eat in a particular dietary camp or choosing to train a certain way, whether you're a powerlifter, bodybuilder, CrossFit, whatever. Like there's a lot of like, that online, which is negative. But if you can actually reach the core, of somebody and really help them and you notice that it sort of manifests into different areas, whether you start with you just start with the small wins. And first, I think the biggest thing is you have to understand what level somebody's at, right? You have to meet them there. You have to kind of validate some of the things that their experiences and kind of where they're at, and maybe understand like why they follow particular uh, rules of thought. Like why do you think this? Okay, well let's explore that. If you can kind of meet somebody and let them know that you understand where they're coming from, and then you just kind of start and building off the small wins there, that's where that like real and true transformation happens. And man, the changes that I've seen with many of the people that I've worked with have been uh, phenomenal, dude. There's so much good that can happen, and people can just feel good. Fuck, like a lot of people get stuck in like, I just want to look good, and like that's great, but like when you feel good, it like trumps everything. And people, a lot of times, sometimes the people that recognize that the most have to go through some sort of like health scare for that to happen. They have a heart attack or something like that. Like, oh shit, like I almost lost my family, and you start implementing whatever XYZ sort of protocol. It doesn't even have to be anything crazy. And you just kind of build on that and stack those wins. It can honestly be transformational outside of just, physically. And yeah, I've seen some insane transformations, and that is the most empowering and rewarding thing, I think, as a coach in this space. And this is simply what drives me to continue learning. Because I'm like, I gotta be a problem solver. But even if I don't know the answer, I bet you I know somebody who does, you know? And it's, yeah, so there can be some phenomenal transformations out there. And I just wish people knew what it felt like to feel good. And there's many ways to get there, but it's a tough road to navigate for a lot of people.
It's
Just
funny
how you do
how,
so.
but it's funny how like the competitive space, regardless of what you're competitive in, that if your baseline is not sick, there's such a lack of gratitude for that. Like the number of deals I've made with any deity that'll listen when I'm sick. Like, look, please pull me through this. I'll go to church on Sunday. Never went to church. I've never followed through on my end of the bargain. Every time I'm sick, like, dude, I had an ice cube in Mexico like a week ago. I'm still praying to anyone that'll listen. Santa Muerta, anyone, Gandhi, anyone, the guy on the bus, anyone, please, for the love of God, make it. The second I feel better, I'm like, oh, right. Like it's blocked out of my brain.
Back to normal.
Like, back to complaining about shit that doesn't matter. But like when you're sick, it's just like nothing else exists when you don't feel good. But how quickly we are to forget that and just be like, oh, they overcooked my steak. This is bullshit. Like.
Exactly, dude. It really can be like that, unfortunately. And I think the downside is when if somebody is invested in a coach who doesn't really know what they should be doing, dude, you're just like compounding one problem. Tell me you've seen Major Pain. It's like one of the best movies ever.
No, but I know what I'm doing later.
Oh my God. Yeah. Major Pain. There's like a scene it's like one of the first scenes in the movie where he walks up. This guy, he's in like a war scene. He's complaining about his shoulder. He's like, oh, my arm. And then he's like, oh, let me take a look at that. He's like, oh, you want me to help you out? He's like, let me see your hand. He pulls up his hand. He's like, you're going to feel a little pressure. And just breaks his finger. It's like, oh, fuck, my finger. It's like, it doesn't hurt anymore. But it's just like, you can just like compound the issues. But it's a funny movie, by the way. You should really watch it. It's a classic. It, it can be very difficult to navigate how to solve certain problems. And you have to go through this maybe sort of hierarchy of like, all right, what do we start with? And this is where it's like people, like I mentioned, people do this with their diets. They kind of step over dollars for pennies. And what are the kind of large foundational things we can start with first to really make a difference that will lead to these sort of smaller wins over time? And that's different for everybody.
Now, half decent transition to my next question. When you're dealing with competitors, when you're dealing with people who just want to feel good, you're dealing with change. And if it's one thing that unanimously, in my experience in dealing with people the way I have to deal with them, the one thing that they don't like is change. Is there a sort of a ubiquitous, universal principle to dealing with behavior change as a coach? Does it differ between person to person? Are there trends that are more aligned with the general health feel good crowd, and they're bucketed between like the people who are in the bodybuilding space versus the general health space? Or is it like, hey, we're all people, they all go through the same thing but different ways? Like that to me is like the fascinating part about what you do, is like, especially when we talk about food, whether we're restricting it infinitely to the point of getting stage ready, or we're looking to change habits. You mentioned something just sort of in passing that I thought was really smart, like why people make the decisions they make. I think it was around to do with alcohol. Maybe it was how they were raised. Like there's, smoking cigarettes, maybe you like to blow a little bit up your nose on the weekend. These are all things that don't keep you alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Food keeps us alive. So dealing with, what I'm sure is, psychological pathologies around food, maybe in the case of a competitor, poor relationship with food might be a more clinically relevant way to word it, or dealing with people who have, psychological behavioral issues with food and overconsumption of food and addiction to food. How is that mental minefield to navigate?
Mm. It's not easy, and of course, some people make it easier than others. But this is where, more than anything, you have to have patience, and some people don't, right? Some people kind of adopt this sort of their prerogative as a coach is like, this is going to be how it's fucking done. You're going to do it this way, like take it or leave it, And I maybe to some degree that works for some people. And granted, I think if it does come down to bodybuilding, it just comes down to principles, it comes down to principles like, hey, whatever your preference is, like I understand it, but there are some principles that are not changing no matter what. You're in a calorie deficit, you're going to lose. Okay. This is not a principle we're going to debate really. And so how we get there though, that is where the navigating comes from. Like, what is that relationship with food like? Man, I've seen it all. The binge restrict, or the people who are like, I'm just going to eat the same exact thing all of the time and never change. And then they take that and then they literally are missing out on several other micronutrients in their diet because they only eat chicken and white rice. Like there's nothing else outside of that. And so you have to understand like kind of where people come from, and it's so tricky. And I see it all. I kind of deal with it all. And you also have to know kind of your boundary, or like what is kind of within that scope. Like what is within your scope? Like, are you dealing with somebody who maybe actually needs to seek professional like help when it comes to their relationship with food? Because I think this is one area that, while coaches who do have integrity and like a good moral compass and this inherent like sort of want and need to help people get from A to B, there are just some things that you're just really not qualified for. And you have to understand, where is that threshold at? And if you can't really help somebody get to that point, then this is where you turn to your resources for help there. But dude, it is such a mixed bag. There are some, I think when you kind of take a lot of things that I try to do with people when it comes to, if they are like kind of an emotional eater and such, it's just understanding and letting them know, hey, here are these principles that are, this is what's going to happen as a result of you doing XYZ, whether that causes a negative outcome or a positive one. We're going to look at this objectively. And so a lot of the way that I speak to people is very direct, but it's also, this is what's happening and this is why, and I can explain why. And this is why understanding what the lab work looks like, what hormone sort of changes or fluctuations are going on. This is why understanding that can really help not just the coach navigate through these things, but help the client as an individual understand why certain things are happening. Because there's so much of this like, oh, I guess it's just me, like this is an issue and it just is the way that it is and there's no fixing it. And a lot of times that's not really the case. It's just having them understand like why it's happening. So
It's funny
yeah.
that people's default is that they're special. It's odd to me that like,
Oh,
I'm just look, man. I've been through this. I've seen all the specialists. Trust me,
Yeah.
man. Trust me. It's different. I'm curious, and if you could walk people through just the process of going through Marek, because I think you guys offer a tremendous service. It's great people involved. I didn't have blood work for years before I got linked up with you guys. You hit me up the other day like, hey, idiot, it's been a while. You should probably get your shot. I was like, yeah, good luck. That's why I fucking like you, dog. I've always been liking you. So just like walk me through the process, because people know that's a sponsor of the podcast. People also know that we don't take on sponsors, which is also, it goes to show you where I hold like you and the company in sort of my in my world and the value that you guys bring. So just walk people, for those of you who are still listening, thank God. Walk people through that process of, okay, this is how you get your labs ordered. This is the process afterwards, and these are the different avenues you can go down.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you navigate to the website, that's where you'll see different lab options that we have. But if you can navigate to our team, if you have a specific health coach, whether that's a female or a male you'd like to work with and such. But when you go to the website, merekhealth.com, you have options to either select a panel where you can get a lab review from a health coach, like somebody like myself or one of our other health coaches. You do have the option to get another panel if you just wanted to grab a lab panel on your own. But if you don't understand labs at all, you don't understand what you're looking at, then I would highly suggest getting an interpretation from a health coach. When you go down that path, you meet with a health coach and you will have that conversation to gather the context around your lifestyle to understand what got you to this point, what brought you here to begin with. Are you looking for what sort of help are you hoping we can help you, with, whether it's a goal you have, fat loss, weight gain, you struggling sexually, whatever it is. So we'll have that conversation, and then we'll get you the appropriate lab work based on whatever we think is appropriate. When that lab work comes back, you'll meet again with your health coach, and we'll interpret those results for you. We'll give you our sort of synopsis. From that step, we'll also be able to meet with one of our medical providers on the team who will provide, obviously, additional oversight. They'll be able to go over your labs with you again and kind of answer your questions, any other further questions that you have. From that point moving forward, that's when you'll kind of be presented with this overall sort of plan and our suggestions on what we feel would be best implemented, our sort of treatment protocol for you, whether that's like, over-the-counter supplementation or whether that's hormonally, whatever it is. And from that point on, you'll have continual sort of monthly intervals where you will connect with the coach, make sure everything is dialed in appropriately, and then we will have follow-up lab work to assess and see how everything is going quantitatively, but also gather that biofeedback. And yeah, we'll just continue to meet month to month over time and make sure that you have regularly scheduled labs and meeting with the medical provider, while also having the ability to consistently, contact your health coach like myself to answer any questions about anything.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because if you guys were paying attention, and hopefully you were listening, but hopefully you were paying attention, this is where I think you guys really shine in the space, and it comes through in the conversation we had. We were 20 minutes in, and I marked it in my brain before we started talking about hormones at all. And I think that's the key differentiating factor. And that was what tipped it over. Obviously, like you and Smokey and Derek, like knowing you guys, knowing you the longest, I think, and then I met Smoke, and then I've chatted with Derek a handful of times. It's like, this is not, this is not your Florida fucking anti-aging clinic bullshit, right? Like, this is health first, which I greatly appreciate. And that was why it was such a no-brainer to partner with the podcast. And I appreciate you reaching out to make sure that I'm still as far away from. I was actually surprised. I thought I thought I was on fire, and then I got my bloods. I was like, "Oh, hey, we're doing." I just need to go outside a little bit more. That was kind of like the main thing. But no, I appreciate everything you guys do. I appreciate you taking the time and letting us your insights and your experience, man. It's been, it's hopefully been insightful. It was insightful for me, hopefully insightful for the audience, man. And we'll put all the show notes in the description with the RX Radio, Marek Health page, and all that. And Michael Warner, thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's been awesome.